Now this is just a simple slide. This shows that the closer you get to freeways, the more you have odds increased asthma. And my point here is again, we're talking about ultrafine particles, we're talking about diesel, and we're talking about chemicals that are not dissimilar from what we see at Santa Monica Airport with the jet aircraft. So we have to speculate that we see neurodegenerative diseases, which I've already mentioned. The labeled ultrafines are translocated from the lung to the brain. The important thing is that the brains of the mice that we exposed have increased markers of inflammation, but it's chronic. It's chronic. We see the inflammation 2 weeks after the last PM exposure. So if you think about breathing ultrafines throughout your lifespan, you're going to have chronic inflammation. It's not an acute response, it's a chronic response, and that may have implications for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's, and for other disease states. Next slide. And this is just oh, that slide didn't turn out so well, but basically, without getting into detail, we see relationships with traffic, and you see evidence of preterm and low-term birth weight babies. And so the ultrafine particles from traffic or aircraft perhaps are significant in terms of having developmental effects as well as the other things that I've talked to you about. You see, the point I want to make is everybody talks about how over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the air's gotten better. Well, it hasn't. What's happened is we have discovered heart disease, asthma, developmental effects, atherosclerosis. Yes, the air has gotten cleaner in terms of visibility, but the diseases that we now understand are responsible from those exposures we didn't know about 10 years ago. And so all of a sudden you can say, yes, the visibility is not backyard barbecue pits, and that goes without saying. What we have seen is new diseases, and we haven't seen the end of this process. And I'm not going to talk about cancer, but there is no question whatsoever, I don't care who says it, there's no question whatsoever that diesel exhaust causes lung cancer in humans. There are 50 studies. These epidemiologists debate and debate and debate and debate till your head comes off. But the fact of the matter is there's no data set like the 50 studies that show positive cancer effects as well, and I don't have time for that. So what we've shown is effects on the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. We've shown low birth weight in preterm babies. We've shown an increase in asthma and other respiratory diseases. We've seen a decrease in lung development and function in children. We've seen atherosclerosis, and we see oxidative stress, which means exposure to what we call pro-oxidants and electrophiles. Those are types of chemicals, and those come from what you saw what I stressed with the slides on the epithelial cells and the mitochondria, that you have these mechanisms that we now understand. And so what we've done in our lab is we can now predict from the time you're exposed until the time you become diseased, we can tell you what the entire process looks like in that what we'll call a roadmap. So that's it for me. I hope this is informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. Earlier, Dr. Fine informed us that ultrafine particles were not regulated. And based on your research, do you believe they should be regulated? Well,
the answer is yes and no. And Phil knows I feel this way, so he won't hit me across the table. What I feel has to be regulated, I showed you the soot core. I showed you all the chemicals that are on the soot core. And I've showed you the vapors. We find, by the way, major toxicity associated with vapors And nobody has studied vapors for the last 100, they've never been studied. We're the only lab in the United States, except maybe for Lovelace, that is studying vapor phase chemicals. So to get back to your question, what I think has to happen is you have, here's your ultrafine particle. It's in the epithelial cell. It's in the mitochondria. As I said before, what's happening is those organic chemicals that are on that surface and those metals are coming off and exerting their toxicity. The soot core isn't toxic. So what the ultrafine is a vehicle for bringing organic chemicals and metals to sensitive parts of the body and to the lungs and what have you. So my sense is that, yes, we can do another PM 2.5, which is not adequate, as we know, and we can do a better job with ultrafines, but we have to regulate those organics and those metals. And that's what's, because they're the ones that are etiologically directly connected to toxicity. They're the toxins. The soots aren't the toxins. So the ultrafine gets you there. It gets it to your brain. But it's the other chemicals that cause the disease.
Thank you. Bill, do you have any questions?
Just curious about the relationship to the Santa Monica Airport. Do you see that as an issue?
I completely do. Most of you know Ping Ho. Ping Ho's son in the 8th grade and I did a study of the Santa Monica Airport. And I think Ping, if she's here, we could probably make that available. It was a great study. We should have published the damn thing. We didn't. He's an 8th grader. You know, they don't think in terms of academics who want to publish or perish. And we showed in that study that there are significant ultrafine particles in the Santa Monica Airport. So my showing you LAX wasn't entirely off base in that sense. So yes, I think that it would that the kind of study where we looked at the particle distribution that I showed you, that would be a very useful study. But let me tell you something, if I may. I don't mean to be so assertive.
It's okay.
What we have 10 or 11 assays we do at UCLA that measure the toxicity and the pathway that I talked about. What you want is to use some of those assays to not just measure the amount of the emissions, but we have quantitative measures that measure the level of toxicity of those constituents. And if you can measure the toxicity of the constituents, then you have something to hold onto your hat with and regulate and make policy decisions.
Do you think if there was a bigger buffer from that airport to the citizenry, that would dramatically decrease it? And should there be, what would be your solution? Forget politics. You don't have to play politics. Just straight out how you see this. What could we do?
Well, let me just say this. I didn't show you a number of slides, but we see that it's not just at the blast fence at LAX, but if you go downwind all the way to the 405, we still see the particles from the takeoff. So you've got a distance to characterize. And the second thing that we saw is we went to the other side of the 405 and went far away from it so we weren't impacted by the 405. And what we did was we looked in people's backyards who were far, far away, and we found particles like we're talking about from planes coming in to land. So you've got takeoff and you've got landing, and the particles from takeoff go a very long distance. So the fact of the matter is, what that means is one has to do studies to look and see how far the community is being affected by the jet stream going back, because there are millions upon millions of particles that are probably reaching homes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you had any conversations with fuel experts as to whether one fuel or another has a significant effect and what kind of combustion is involved in complete combustion? What would the ideal fuel be?
The question that he's asking, that Channel 35 will be able to record, because that's why I'm saying it, is how impactful is it? Could you change different fuels? How could you make it better, is basically what he's saying about the exhaust.
I'll tell you what we did. This was a small study, and what we did was we didn't look at fuels. We should have. My fault, we didn't have enough money. What we did do, though, is look at the differences between jet aircraft engines and emissions. And there we have data that suggests that there are differences between jet aircraft engines. So the question you're asking and the question the way I just answered it are part of a package, I think, that deserves further investigation.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. We're going to call up our next panel, and we have Bill Piazza, we have Dr. Kim Huang, Dr. Phil Finnegan, and Dr. Jean Ospito. So while we're switching out this panel, let me just explain to you again, if you're interested in these studies or these PowerPoint presentations, again, you can go to the following website, which is air.senate.ca.gov, and you can download all of these studies and websites.
Great.
Suddenly, you want to wear a gas mask.
Right.
Bill, I'm moving over here because otherwise, if I sat there, I'll try and get into your conversation.
Thank you.
When do we do this video thing? Should do it last.
But after Bill Piazza.
So Bill, you're going to go first.
And then Irving went to video Paulson. So
Okay, so the order will be Bill Piazza, followed by a video of Dr. Suzanne Paulson, followed by Dr. Kim Huang, and then Dr. Phil Fine and Dr. Jean Ospito. If we're running slightly behind, so if you could keep your presentations to under 10 minutes each, that'd be helpful. So Bill, if you go ahead.
I'll help you along in that regard. Senator Liu, Councilman Rosendahl, good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Bill Piazza. I'm an environmental assessment coordinator with the Los Angeles Unified School District. As a member of the Santa Monica Airport Working Group, I had the pleasure to prepare a comprehensive assessment of air quality conditions associated with airport operations at Santa Monica Airport. My testimony is short, and it's sweet, at least I think it's sweet, and invite those interested to read the full text of my report, which is available online. The Santa Monica Municipal Airport Health Risk Assessment was designed to quantify community exposures from both criteria and toxic air contaminants associated with aircraft and ground support operations. The assessment utilized a refined approach to assess the downwind extent of contaminant emissions throughout the local community. Relevant technical methodologies and regulatory guidance from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Aviation Administration were incorporated into the analysis to ensure that the assessment was viable. To predict the downwind extent of contaminant concentrations, the U.S. EPA's Industrial Source Complex short-term model was used extensively to perform the dispersion analysis. When presented in 1999, the report offered the most comprehensive assessment relating to the generation of pollutants from an airport landing facility. Results of the assessment revealed that cancer risks for the maximum exposed individuals who live in proximity of the airport were 26 in 1 million. This value represents a discrete cancer risk associated with airport-related exposures. No background or ambient concentrations were incorporated into the risk quantification. Notwithstanding, emissions associated with airport operations were found to exceed the Act's clean air goal of 1 in a million. For particulates, the analysis revealed that both short-term and annual PM10 concentrations would not contribute to a violation of the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. For lead, contaminant concentrations were also found to be de minimis and not anticipated to meet or exceed the National Air Quality Standards. However, this is not to say that impacts don't exist. The data was limited. There is so much paucity in the data, and the data was limited to a few sources that I could incorporate to fully characterize their true extent. Although there are uncertainties associated with discrete variants or assumptions, such as aircraft exhaust emission factors, used to perform this assessment, it is believed that attention to regulatory guidance and the use of relevant tools, that is, conceptual and mathematical models, utilized to prepare the assessment provide a best estimate of community-based exposures. And you'll see this with a discrepancy possibly with a modeling approach versus a monitoring approach, and hopefully that will be teased out a little bit, or questions will come at what is a better approach. I mean, they are both and all tools to assess exposure. And if I may opine a little bit, although federal and state laws regulate the generation and subsequent risk associated with toxic air emissions from select stationary source operations, airports as a discrete source category are not expressly evaluated as a generator of toxic air emissions. Notwithstanding, airports are among the largest single source emitters of pollutants due to an array of emission sources associated with their operation: aircraft, motor vehicles, ground support equipment, and stationary plant operations. However, existing regulations at the federal and state level only offer control for limited stationary source categories, such as gasoline dispensing facilities, should these operations relate only to airport operations. With that said, it is my belief that the regulatory community should promulgate appropriate regulations that require airport landing facilities to disclose on-field emissions in a manner consistent with existing community right-to-know laws, as well as notifying communities of the risks associated with exposures to carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic compounds, as is done under programs such as California's AB 2588, the Air Toxic Hotspots Information and Assessment Act, for all emission sources, including aircraft. We have regulations for transportation facilities and ports such as Los Angeles and Long Beach. It is time that they encompass airports as well. I thank you for your time and consideration.
I just want to thank you, Bill. You've been sort of a pioneer and trailblazer in doing studies, and I think you did the first study that did rise to the level of awareness to all of us, and we're very grateful for that.
I did. Thank you.
Where do you think we should go at this point heading forward? We're having a state senate hearing. We're having a substantive discussion. What's your vision of what can be done or should be done?
I believe there will always be debate relative to the results that come out of any study. And it will be interpreted if you're for the airport in one way, if you're against the airport in another way. We've seen that for how many years now? I think full disclosure is really what's needed. And as I mentioned, I think that, and I know this is difficult, but there is a community right to know issue. And I think that emissions associated with these types of source categories need to be made available. The laws exist. They've been around for an awfully long time. And I think if we can't control the emissions in flight, we can certainly control the emissions on ground. The study that I did clearly shows that the preponderance of the emissions and the impact associated with carcinogenic exposures comes from the taxi and idle phase of the aircraft's operations. Those are on ground. Those can be measured. The time it takes for aircraft to taxi and idle clearly can be determined, and the emissions associated with that aircraft certainly can be made available. The other problem is that we don't really have good data from the FAA on the actual exhaust emissions. We don't know exactly what the full speciation of compounds really are. And that would be helpful to have, and also I think if we have a full disclosure requirement such as community right to know, that may be teased out and we'll get some better data as well. But I also think that there's, aside from community right to know and information regarding this is the super stuff and crap that is being emitted from this particular source category, we could also require those entities to prepare health risks assessment. I mean, you've got, again, AB 2588, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, in their toxic rules require health risk assessments for smokestack industries and other sources. How come the airports don't have that same requirement or responsibility?
Thank you very much for that, Doctor. I call you Doctor. Everybody's a doctor here, but you're a doctor.
Call me, you know what? Call me anything you like. It's okay.
Thank you, Bill.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wong, you go next, and then we're going to go to the video.
Honorable Ted Liu, Honorable Bill Rosendo, my name is Kim Huang, and I'm from the U.S. EPA Region 9 office in San Francisco. And I'm here to present a summary of a study that EPA had performed in 2008, which the final report came out in 2010. So without further ado, I'm going to just start on the presentation to save the time. Can you just go back? Yeah. So I just want to point out that I'm actually new to the AIR program, and the presentation that you are seeing here was contributed majorly by Marian Hoyer, who is from our Office of Transportation and Air Quality, Arnold Den, who used to be in my position and is now retired, and Matt Lakin, who's also in my office. Thank you. Next. So I'm going to, in my talk, I'm going to just give a very brief background on lead emissions from piston engine aircraft at the national level, and go into the reason of why we conducted a study at the Santa Monica Airport, and give you a very brief summary of the results of the study and the recommendation that came from the study. I also would like to point out that EPA has a very extensive website on lead and the other major lead sources, and the website is provided there. Next, please. So at the national level, if we're talking about the different sources that contributed lead to the ambient air, these sources came from gasoline for piston engine aircraft, which are not used in commercial passenger aircraft. They also came from metal industries, manufacturing industries, waste incinerators, industrial, commercial, utility boilers. And in 2008, these collective sources emitted 990 tons. And about more than half of that lead were emitted due to the leaded aviation gasoline. And again, about half of that 551 tons is emitted in flight, and the rest of it is emitted in the local flying area around the airports. Thanks. So this is a map of the U.S. where we're showing here about the 20,000 public and private airports and heliports that have aircrafts running on what we call AV gas, which is the aviation gasoline with the leaded aviation gasoline. So in 2006, EPA received a petition from Friends of the Earth requesting us to set up a standard if we find enough information for the endangerment to public health and welfare. And if there's not enough information, that we could start some kind of study. So in 2007, we issued a notice requesting input on a wide range of issues regarding emissions of lead from piston aircraft. And in 2010, we issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to let people know that we are studying this issue and we are requesting additional information. Next. So I'm going to elaborate on this slide a little. So when we started looking into this issue, we found out that there wasn't a lot of information about lead emission and concentrations near airports. And so we started these studies to develop a modeling approach to understand better the gradient of concentrations of the lead near airports. And since lead emissions from aircraft and leaded AV gas are federally regulated, the emissions is regulated by EPA, and the AV gas itself is regulated by FAA. And also in light of the petition that I described in the previous slide, we embarked on this study in order to eventually conduct a national scale analysis of the local impact of lead emissions from piston engine aircraft. And the reason that we selected the Santa Monica Airport was actually threefold. We were building upon the information that were collected by South Coast AQMD at SMO, and also there's no other major sources of lead around the airport. And also the airport actually have collected a lot of information that we would need to put into the model. And then the last and very important reason is the airport actually welcomed us to come and do the study, and that's very important. So next. So as I mentioned before, we did the study in 2008, and the study has three parts. We collected very limited monitoring data in air, soil, and dust. And the air data is mainly to conduct a modeling comparison, a comparison between modeling and monitoring effort. And so the monitoring was only done for, I think, a couple of weekends in the summer and in the winter. And again, and also we monitored the soil and the dust, also in a very limited sense, mainly to see whether there's any potential gradient of lead relative to distance from the airport. The second part of the study was we collected a lot of air quality information that we have to input into the model. And those information include the lead inventory for all of the sources within 25 kilometers of the airport, including factors like the aircraft counts by hour, the lead emissions locations on airport property, etc. So those type of information are needed to run the model. And the last part of the study is the data analysis. What we did with the model was we actually run the model for every day in 2008, and we did a calculation for what we call a 3-month rolling average and select out the maximum of those 3 months rolling average to compare it to the lead National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So the lessons that we've learned from the air monitoring, these are, from here on I'm talking about the results of the study, that the average lead concentrations in the air were about the same range as what reported by South Coast AQMD from their study in 2006-2007. The concentrations at upwind locations around the West Tarmac were at or below 0.004 microgram per cubic meter. Concentration at downwind locations, which is the East Tarmac area, range from 0.039 to 0.071 microgram per cubic meter. And the concentrations at neighborhood size downwind range from 0.033 to 0.056 microgram per cubic meter. And what we've learned from the air modeling is that on an individual day basis, the modeling results agreed well with the monitored values, and it provides a strong confidence for us to apply the model to other airports. The lead concentrations above the local background levels extended up to about 500 meters downwind from the airport. And the engine run-up check had a significant impact on ambient air, on ambient lead concentrations. And this is important because we had not previously included run-up emissions in air quality modeling. Roadway dust was not a significant contributing factor to ambient lead levels near the airport. So comparing that to the lead National Ambient Air Quality Standard, which was revised in 2008 to a level of 0.15 microgram per cubic meter, and that's a tenfold lower than the previous value, which was 1.5 microgram per cubic meter. Again, the standard is measured as the maximum 3 months average concentration, and I would like to point out in the description of the study that we did not collect enough the samples over a 3 months period to provide a relevant comparison to the modeled average. The modeled concentrations at 2 locations on airport have a 3 months average lead concentrations above the NAC standard of 0.15 microgram per cubic meter. But I also would like to point out that the reason for that was the monitor that we put at the location on the airport is actually about 75 meters from the location where the model predict the maximum concentration. And that's why what you see from the model is a maximum concentration, and that is from a location that is about 75 meters from where we put the monitor. But when we put the monitor, we didn't know that fact. And I also would like to point out that this modeling value cannot be used to determine attainment status for the NACs. Attainment status can only be shown by monitoring data, and it's a very stringent protocol for providing those monitoring data. And the other point from the modeling effort is that all of the individual days monitoring data were lower than the modeled 3 month average values. The soil and dust monitoring was very limited, and we did the monitoring on airport property, local parks, and at local residences. And the results show that there's no elevated lead on airport property or in local parks compared to the average non-source impacted levels in California. 2 home samples had lead levels above either the EPA or the draft California EPA lead screening levels. And the aviation lead might have contributed to this level, but some other results, but the results show that there might be some other additional sources. So what are the implications of this study for the other airports? The air monitoring and the modeling approaches that we use for the Santa Monica Airport is fully applicable to all of the other local other local scale airports. However, Santa Monica had 1 runway, so if you go to other airports with multiple runways and the prevailing wind directions might require some additional data than what we've collected for Santa Monica. And the recommendation that came from this study for other airports include conduct on-site survey of piston engine aircraft activities, collect hourly activity patterns, use on-site wind speed and wind direction data, use site-specific terrain and land use data, and include stationary sources within at least 20 kilometers. Our current focus and activity, I mentioned before that we had issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. So we are pretty much performing the studies that we lay out in the ANPR. The model piston engine emissions of lead at airports to evaluate the impact on local air quality and exposure to lead. And we're also evaluating the data from lead monitors. And we will issue a proposal describing our analysis and our proposed positions on the question of endangerment And there is an opportunity for public comment to our proposal before any action is finalized, and then we will issue a final decision document. So I would like to point out that if you go to this website where the ANPR is published in the Federal Register, it does say that the comment period was closed on August 27, 2010. However, I had checked with the person in charge of this project, and she said that she will accept comments. And so if you would like to submit comments, please go to the Federal Register and follow the instruction to submit further comments. And here's just where you can obtain information on the study that I just presented. We've also, on this webpage, we've also have information on how we are responding to the petition from the Friends of the Earth. And the next slide is my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to ask questions at the end. We're going to try to go through all the witnesses. So,
Please.
sure.
Grab with the mic. We need that mic for him for the camera to get it in this thing. They need to put it on the tape.
There's a mic right there.
I've just done a fairly major piece of work for Cal EPA, in which what I did was to work on models that linked the air lead levels that she's been talking about with blood lead levels, which is generally historically a measure of health effects risk. And so we've been focusing on that, and I just wanted to tell you about one finding that's very important, because it has implications for these numbers that we're hearing. And that is that the National Toxicology Program and work that we've been doing have now, the Center for Disease Control has said that a safe level for lead in the blood is 10 micrograms per deciliter. What the new study shows is that there is significant cognitive decline in children at levels between 1 and 5. In other words, there's no safe level. And so what you have to really keep in mind is whatever the regulations may be, one needs to determine what the population distribution of blood leads are going to be based on those numbers, which can be done. But the important point I want to mention is that the blood lead data, the health data, is at the 1 to 5 level, and that's really quite striking, and it will have to have CDC reevaluate their work.
Thank you. Maybe if you get more grant funding, you could do blood lead levels around Santa Monica Airport. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, our next witness we're going to do by video, and we're going to see if technology works. It's Dr. Suzanne Paulson, PhD, UCLA, and she's going to talk about aircraft mission impacts in a neighborhood adjacent to Santa Monica Airport.
Paulson, and I am a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences and also the vice chair of that department here at UCLA. And I'm here to tell you about a study that we did mostly about 3 years ago, but I also have some very recent data looking at air quality around Santa Monica Airport. And first I'd like to say thank you for inviting me. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. And so thanks to the elected officials who put this together. I'm sorry that I'll miss my colleagues, and I'm sorry that I'll also miss seeing my neighbors who are there in the audience. And so before I start, I want to tell you a little bit about the people who did most of the work. Shishan Hu was a postdoc in our group, and Wanshik Choi is also a postdoc, done some of the more recent work. The activities, the A's are arrivals and the D's are departures. So we see planes coming and going, and we see the particle concentrations going up to very high levels, in this case up to several million, which is a concentration that we would typically only see if we were right in the plume following behind a diesel truck, for example. in an urban area. So we don't see those commonly except in these exceptional situations. And we see the particle concentrations remain very elevated, so over 100,000, whereas the residential average would be below 10,000 in that neighborhood for most of the hour. In the afternoon, the levels are generally quite a bit lower. That's expected because in the afternoons the wind speeds are higher, so the atmosphere mixes and the pollutants are diluted more rapidly away from the source, but still we see highly elevated concentrations at regular intervals throughout the period. The polyaromatic hydrocarbons and black carbon are plotted on a linear scale, and we see really large peaks associated particularly with departure events, but not so much the arrivals. So we see big spikes in these concentrations, and the background for these things is very low, so those are also quite elevated. This shows the average concentrations of ultrafine particles and black carbon at the 4 different sites that we made measurements at where we had stopped our mobile platform. Clarkson Avenue, Bundy and National, that's at the gas station right at that intersection. Brookhaven and Barrington, which is a site that's directly downwind but almost 700 meters downwind. And relative to the background concentration for ultrafine particles and black carbon, and in both cases we see that for all of our measurements taken together when we were there, the levels are elevated relative to the background. And for someone like myself who spent a lot of time studying the influence of freeways and the size of freeway plumes, these results are pretty surprising because during the day when these measurements were made, we would not expect to be able to see any signature of the freeway more than about 300 meters downwind. And from the airport, we're seeing under relatively windy daytime conditions, elevated concentrations even nearly 700 meters downwind. So this speaks to the observation that individual aircraft have extremely high levels of ultrafine particles and related pollutants, and that they're not diluted particularly effectively. They're not followed by another vehicle, which tends to mix the pollutants away and so on. So there's a relatively and kind of surprisingly high impact area. So this data shows, this is data that I haven't shown before in public. It's data that looks at concentrations of ultrafine particles in different neighborhoods in the area. So this little area is what we're calling Santa Monica Airport. It's 1 street away from the little cul-de-sacs that go up to the takeoff area. And other areas, all of them are removed so that we don't expect to see any direct effect of the freeways. And they don't include the major surface streets, which have a little bit higher concentrations, but typically lower than what we would see from the aircraft activity. And so we have levels for each of these 4 microenvironments. And when we look at the levels, we have data here for 2008. This is several days averaged together, 4 or 5 days. These are single-day results for 2011. They're measurements that we were making before and after and during Carmageddon, because we're interested in what that did to the pollutant concentrations. And in this plot, we have what we call interquartile distances. So the bottom of the bar represents the lowest 25% of the measurements, and the top of the bar is the 75th percentile, and the middle is the median. And then this goes 90 or 10% to 90th percentile, 5% to 95th percentile. So we can see the full range of the data in each of these microenvironments. So the other neighborhoods are pretty similar. It's a little bit higher. This one is downwind of the 405 and the 10 freeways. But generally the same area, Santa Monica Airport neighborhood clearly stands out as highly elevated compared to these other neighborhoods. And these are just single days, and they're over a relatively short time period. We haven't looked at what the aircraft activity was during those time periods, and that's probably that combined with meteorological variability is what's responsible for the variations from day to day. But during Carmageddon, we see that the air was really clean. Hardly anybody was driving. It was really quite a remarkable day. And indeed, we saw that in the particle concentrations, very, very, very low levels of these pollutants. except in the neighborhood that's downwind of Santa Monica Airport. And this just shows, I don't have time to go into it in detail, but basically this, what's plotted on this axis is a proxy for the size of the aircraft or the fuel consumption rate, and this shows peak ultrafine particle concentrations. And associated with activities of aircraft, we got the data for which particular aircraft was taking off at each particular time. And it shows basically exactly what you would expect. Larger aircraft produce more particles. There's one other point that's not on here. It's somewhere over in the neighborhood over here. And that's a very large jet that produced really, really large concentrations. So the smaller aircraft are producing much less, and the jets are contributing a lot more. So in summary, the concentrations of freshly emitted pollutants are consistently elevated in the neighborhoods downwind of Santa Monica Airport. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, then you should ask my colleague Phil Fine, and I think he'll do an excellent job of answering whatever you might have about our part of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, that was for you, Dr. Fine. And if you're going to, you and Dr. Ospita will make the last scientific presentation today.
Thanks again, and I'll be making the presentation. Dr. Ospital's here if there's some questions on the health effects that come up during my talk or later on. Thanks again. Hello, everyone, again. Happy to be the bookend for the presentations this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple studies that AQMD has done specific to Santa Monica Airport. And I'll first talk about the first one that was done back in 2006 and 2007. We received a grant from the US EPA to look at a variety of air toxic issues. And one of the projects within that grant was to look at general aviation airports. And we did work at Van Nuys Airport and Santa Monica Airport. The study was focused on long-term exposure. Earlier today I showed you those maps of diesel PM and the cancer risk associated with that. So what we did for these studies under this grant was do the same type of sampling we did for those MATE studies. And those are really focused on long-term cancer risk. So while we had a few measurements that gave you kind of these short-term concentrations, most of this first study was looking at long-term risk. We did 2 3-month sampling periods at Santa Monica, and again 2 3-month sampling periods at Van Nuys, going back and forth. And the idea was to look at the potential impact of the airport emissions on what we measured in the community, and then see if we can attribute that, again, to different airport activity. Next slide. So why was Santa Monica Airport chosen? Again, there's obviously a lot of community concerns, and we know from this chart up in front of everyone that there's a much increased number of private jet traffic over the past 10 to 20 years. The other unique part about Santa Monica Airport, and this is one of the reasons that EPA came here to do this study that you heard about, is that the proximity of the runway and the takeoff area and the blast vents to the community is really unique, at least in Southern California, if not the state or the country. Most airports have a much larger buffer zone between aircraft activity and where people are living. So it was a good place to look for these impacts in the community. So the way we designed the study was we kind of located sampling sites along the flight path, both downwind and upwind, and then we had a few satellite sites off to the side. Again, you see these wind roses again, showing that for most of the study that the winds lined up just right along the runway, blowing from west to east. And next slide. And this is just a close-up of that blast fence area. You could see that it's about 250 feet from where the aircraft take off to the nearest residence. And where we sampled our Site 3 and Site 2 was one residence in that neighborhood, and then we had another site that was actually on airport property right next to the blast fence. Next slide. So like Suzanne showed, Professor Paulson showed, there was a wide variety of measurements that we took. And again, this was modeled on kind of our regional air toxic studies. A few things we did differently was we added ultrafines to this. We also had some carbon monoxide measurements. But in general, we tried to follow what we've done in MATES, again, designed to look at long-term exposure and long-term risk. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of give you the punchline first, a summary of the findings. Again, and you've heard from other studies and other people here that the lead levels in the community and near the runways, while they're below even the new federal standards, as was shown in the EPA study, but they were elevated. The closer you are to that takeoff area, the higher the lead levels were, although it did not exceed the standard. We did have over 3 months of measurements that's easier to compare to those national standards, and when you average it out, it did not exceed, but again, it was anywhere from 5 to 10 times higher than background levels would have been. When we looked at kind of the more traditional pollutants, carbon monoxide, PM, those organic gases I talked about earlier, another class of compounds called carbonyls, we really couldn't see the impact of the airport on long-term samples that we took. It's not to say that they weren't emitted, but when they're emitted in short-term bursts when aircraft activity is occurring, and when that gets averaged over all that time in between the takeoffs and all the clean air at night, that you kind of lose that signal again. But a lot of these pollutants are looked at for long-term risk, so you have to integrate that risk over a long-term exposure. And again, the final finding was ultrafine particles, again, I've mentioned earlier, by number concentration. They're significantly elevated near the runways during aircraft operations. Both short-term peaks, as well as if you average it over the entire study, you still see highly elevated levels near the runways and in that community. Next slide. So these are some lead results over the 2 phases, one phase in kind of the spring, another phase in the winter, and you can see what we call a gradient. Higher levels where the source is, and then as you move away, it goes down. We got an 85, and then it goes down to 28 in the community, and about 4.5 further away, and then as you go upwind, you're down in the 3s. Again, the federal standard is 150. We never exceeded that. We're at 85 or 77. But again, you see what we call a gradient as concentrations drop off as you move away from the source area. For comparison, I mean, we get pretty low levels of lead in West LA. Downtown LA, we get somewhere between 9 and 15 on average, and over the whole basin, we get about 9. So these are higher levels. These are definitely influenced by the aviation gas and the propeller driven aircraft at the airport. Again, the jet fuel does not have lead in it, so these are driven by the smaller planes that have traditional engines. Next slide. Again, now I have a lot of slides like this that look very similar to Professor Paulson's slides. So these are kind of our short-term data. Again, ultrafine particles. We see that you get the peaks. This is multiple days. So what you're seeing in the red and the blue are a 1 hour average of those things, and you're seeing kind of the daily cycles when the airport is open versus when the airport is closed at night. So that's what you see, those little red peaks moving across multiple days. And we can show, when we zoom in, that those peaks correspond primarily to aircraft takeoffs. The other thing you could see is that we get the highest peaks at the East Tarmac site, which is on airport property next to the blast fence. And then those peaks are mirrored, although sometimes at a lower level, at the residents in that nearby community about 300 feet downwind.